In this full-length painting tutorial, I'll show you how to paint this eye-catching floral in watercolour using my Learn to Paint as You Paint approach. So if you're looking for a quick project, you may want to try this. Okay, let's talk about the materials. The paints that I'm using for this tutorial are all by Mungo, but use whatever you have in your own collection. The paper that I'm using is a cold press, and I'll talk to you a little bit later on about that. And the brushes that I'm using for today are spotter brushes, a number 2 and a number 6 for applying the paint. These have shorter bristles and make application easier, and a synthetic flat brush for blending and lifting out. We have a reference photograph and a line drawing that relate to this tutorial, and I'll tell you how you can access that for free a little bit later on in this tutorial. So we have our water, our drawing, our paints and our kitchen towel to blot on, and we are good to go. So I start by mixing purple to a sort of watery consistency, and I also have a puddle of red, and I'm adding ochre to the purple, and I'm going to be dipping in and out of these colours as I work through. Make sure that you have enough water within your pigment so that it makes application a lot easier. You don't want a dry mix, you need it to have lots of pigment and lots of water. So I'm using my number 6 size spotter to apply the paint for this particular wash, and I also have a mix of ochre at the top of the palette there. So you can see me applying the paint wet on dry straight onto the watercolour paper. Just a quick note on the paper that I'm using for this painting tutorial. This is a knot surface. This is a bumpy or rougher surface, and I'm using it because I had quite a bit left over in my stash, but I am actually a huge fan of cold press paper, and I've done a separate video on different types of paper that you can use for watercolour, and I'll put it in the top of your screen right now if you'd like to take a look at that. So you can see me applying the paint with the tip of the brush, pushing it into the pencil lines like this. I'm cleaning my brush in the water, patting it on the kitchen paper and just wiggling it at the bottom to soften that edge there. We want the bottom part of the petals to be slightly lighter, although I did go in slightly heavy-handed on this one, but it's easily sorted out a little bit later on. So you'll notice how I added the purple paint to begin with, and then I also mixed the red tone together so that they gently merged on the paper. So once again, working petal by petal, apply the mix like this straight up to the pencil line, paying close attention to the outline of the petal, making sure that you stay within that line. And you can see me dropping in a little bit of the French ultramarine as well. Now, as I said at the beginning of this tutorial, I'm not going to be painting it true to the reference photograph this time. This is more of a floral piece, and I'm just using the reference photograph as a guide, so you can really be a little bit more artistic with this painting. So once again, I'm jumping between petals that are not touching each other because we don't want the wet paint to blend into the adjoining petals. So make sure that you have a little bit of a gap whilst you're waiting for that paint to dry. And you can see here how lovely the pink tone and the purple tone merge together as you apply it. If you are trying this tutorial for yourself, then I would recommend that you used a cold pressed paper for this, and the reference to the other video will also be in the description box underneath this one if you'd like to take a look. Notice how I'm using the damp brush to soften out the end part of the petal like this. You can even lift out some of the paint if you want it to have that lighter base as we do. So I'm just using the sort of damp brush to push it onto the paper and gently lift off that paint. And that solves the problem of adding too much paint, as I did in the beginning. It's important that you have different colours within your petals. So for example, this one here, I'm adding more of a purple tone towards the outside edge because I want them to look really different against each other. Now remember that watercolour paint dries a little bit lighter, so we'll need to maybe put a few more glazes onto the paint once it's dry. So watercolour glazing simply means that you're applying another colour on top of the dry watercolour to enhance the colour or maybe change it a little bit. And we'll talk about that and I'll show you that as we work through this tutorial. So if you're looking for a really quick project, you may want to try this tutorial. It took me about 2 hours to paint, so and it's really fun to do. So you can see me here using a flat synthetic brush to sort out that little error there. I went outside the pencil line, so I'm just using the brush, just damp, patting it on the kitchen towel, and then you can remove any errors. And it's also another good way of lifting out any paint that you may have been a little bit overzealous with, as I have towards the base of these petals, and just patting it dry with the kitchen paper. And I've actually lifted out a bit too much paint there, but that doesn't matter, we can paint over that. It's really important when you're painting wet on dry on this particular cold press paper that you have enough water. So you want it to be movable. You don't want a sort of dry, sticky mix. You want to be able to push that paint right up against your pencil lines so that it moves really freely and gives that beautiful blur as the colours merge together. So at the beginning of this tutorial, I mentioned that we have a line drawing and reference photograph if you'd like to join in, and you can have free access to these over at our Facebook group. I will put the link to the group in the description box underneath this video, so do consider joining us there, where you can have access to all the line drawings and the reference photographs to the tutorials here on YouTube. So the paints I'm using are from Mungo. If you're starting out painting and want a really good quality paint, then I recommend these. A student of mine suggested them to me and I absolutely love them. You can see the colour payoff that you have, and all the colours that I'm using for this I'll put in the description box underneath this video. But if you don't have this brand and you have a particular brand that you like to use, please use whatever paints that you have within your palette, and the same goes for the brushes and of course the paper. Use what you have. Just using the tip of this brush to push the paint into the pencil line. We want a nice neat edge here. And because we're not working true to the reference photograph, you could probably paint this flower in whatever colours you wanted to. It doesn't really have to be the colours that I've chosen. Try to have a different colour as you hit the adjoining petal though. You want them to look separate petals and not just a blur of colour. So you can see that maybe if I have a purple edge on one side, I would add a pink on the other and so on. You just want them to stand out a little bit. So I've applied the pink tone to the other petals, and you'll notice I've added some water to the pigment because I wanted it to look slightly more faded. So this is the number 2 size flat synthetic brush. This one's from Rosemary Co, and I'm just patting it onto the kitchen towel. It's damp, and I'm using it to gently merge the colours together where I've lifted out the paint. Any errors can be lifted out at this point. So onto the greens. I'm using sap green. This is from Mungo, but I've noticed it's not true to my other sap greens. So if you are using any other sap green for this tutorial and you want the vibrancy that I have here, I would suggest adding something like a lemon yellow just to give it a bit of vibrancy, or even if you've got leaf green or something like that, that would work. And the darker green there, I've added a little bit of deep phthalo green, and I'll go on to add a little bit of indigo to make the darker tone later on. But first of all, I'm just applying the sap green all over the leaves like this. We want this to be our base tone, and we are going to glaze over it later with the different watercolours. So I'm applying this green tone over the entire leaf like this, and once the paint has settled just a little bit, as it did with the petals, I'm dropping in some of the darker green tone, and this is a mix of the phthalo green with a little bit of sap. But you can see how it just gives that little bit of tonal variation and a little bit of a boost. I'm just adding a little bit more phthalo green to the mix here, just to give it a bit more vibrancy and a bit more colour. You can see, because this is now kind of wet in wet, because the underlying paint is wet, how beautifully these kind of colours softly merge together. This is, of course, our first wash, and we will still be glazing over these a little bit later on. And just continuing the process for the other leaves like this. So you can see that I'm just continuing now to apply this green mix to the other leaves like this, and still continuing to mix the colours together whilst the paint is still wet on the paper like this. You can see how beautifully these colours merge, just really, really simply and really easily, to give this really kind of bold, vibrant colours, which I absolutely love. And particularly so, this bright green against the pink and the purple, I think it really stands out and looks absolutely beautiful. And I'm using these spotter brushes again. You could use, I'm using spotter brushes to paint, but you could use any kind of round brush that you have, or your favourite go-to brush. It doesn't matter as long as you're comfortable using it. I like using spotters because they have a kind of really stubby little bristle, which makes, to me, application really, really easy, but just use the ones that you have. And you can see how I'm dropping in the darker green. I've added a little bit of indigo to the mix just to give it a really sort of stronger tone and make it stand out a little bit more. So we have sap green, deep phthalo green and indigo on the top of this leaf here. And once again on this upper leaf, I'm just watering the mix down so that it looks slightly less vibrant and it looks like it's kind of fading a little bit into the background. And I'm still dropping in the different colour, even though this one is faded, just to make it a little bit less flat. And you can just keep going with these leaves until you're happy with the depth of colour. But we are going to be glazing over, as I said. Once the paint is dry, we can add further dimension to it, but we have to let it dry first of all. But for now, we'll just continue to drop in these beautiful colours and let them do their work sort of naturally by blurring into each other like this. Using the tip of my brush to gently push the colours into the pencil line. As watercolour dries, it tends to retract a little bit, so I'm just using the brush to manipulate the paint into that pencil line just to sharpen it up. Everything is now dry, so we can take another look at the leaves by glazing over them, as I've just said. So making sure that the paint is absolutely dry, I'm adding some indigo with my number 2 size spotter here. This will just give us a little bit more control over the paint application, and just painting in some negative spaces like this and sharpening up around that little bud. So negative painting is when you paint around a shape to give it shape, like this. Really, really easy to do. And once I've applied the colour, I will, as usual, just clean my brush into the water and just soften it through once it's damp. You can see how I'm just wiggling that brush to merge the colours together. You don't have to do this detail, it's just something I like to do, and I thought it would give a little bit of interest to the composition. So applying the paint like this, working around those little veins negatively by painting around the shape, and then just blending it in with a damp brush. And once again working around that little bud at the top of the petals. And I'm just continuing this process on the other leaves, as you can see. Once again, just dipping in and out of the green tones that I've mixed on my palette. When you glaze with watercolour, you can still see the colour underneath. Because watercolours are transparent, it just gives it another dimension. So now that most of our greens are in place, we can refocus on the petals of these beautiful flowers. And I have the same mixes as I had in the beginning, but now just going over some of the areas within the petals just to enhance the colour and give it a bit more vibrancy like this. Just following the pattern that I already have in place and just sharpening up those edges with the watercolour paint. At this stage, the mix of the paint must be slightly thicker, but only slightly because you still want to have enough water in it so that you can apply it onto the paper like this. Notice how it changes the colour slightly by applying these glazes, and you can see it's almost magical how this happens and how beautiful it looks. Once again, avoiding the lighter area at the base of the petals. And just lifting out some of the colour with a number 2 size spotter. And adding a tiny bit of green to the centre like this. Now this isn't a botanical painting, but if you do like botanical painting, we do have a Patreon site that you can see here. Patreon is a membership platform. We have a few different membership tiers for different rewards every month to fit your budget depending on what it is. Plus, it's a really good way to help you support my channel. And if you are enjoying this video, please hit the subscribe button and the like, because it really does help to support me more than you know. But at this point, you could call your painting finished. However, I decided to put a background in, and I really love this colour. If you're using the set from Mungo, it would have a sort of turquoisey tone, but this is actually made by Shin Han. I had a lot left over, but if you're doing the background, use any sort of purpley, any kind of turquoise tone that you have. And I've mixed a puddle of sap green and another puddle of sap green with deep phthalo green, and I'm going to use the same application process that I used for the leaves and the flowers, taking this paint carefully around each of them like this and dropping in the other colours like this. And you can see once again how these colours just beautifully merge together, given this gorgeous kind of bluey green background like this. It makes it look so pretty, and it makes those beautiful pinks really stand out. And I'll continue to do this right the way through until the end of the painting, and I will stop talking now and let you listen to some music and watch me complete this background.